Hello there, I am Chris Schmidt and welcome to Mapstermind's Crystal Pack 1 overview video. The goal of this video is all about talking about this new crystal pack and how to use it inside of Wonderdraft. We're going to go over installation, some different use cases, and maybe some advanced techniques inside of Wonderdraft that you've never done. So let's take a look at this image. I've included this image inside of the zip file, maybe just as inspiration. This was where I tested to see how the crystals worked inside of Wonderdraft. And like I say, I'm quite pleased. And I went way overboard going into way too much detail, but you can see how we can integrate these crystals among mountains. We can mix them together with trees, like over here with this kind of lightning effect I did. And I can zoom around. You can see we've got like this evil land area with red crystals. Lots of nice detail over here. I go way too overboard when I'm making this type of thing. So placing crystals on top of mountains, lots of different fun techniques. So just some inspiration for you to check out. Now, let's talk about some important stats involved in this. There are 7 different categories of crystals, and we'll go over those. And each of those different categories has 5 different styles of crystal. Inside of each style, there's between 20 and 30 different images, meaning in this overall pack, there are 803 different images. Now, before we go any further, I want to give a shout out for something we're going to be using while we go through these techniques, and that is a couple of different asset packs, my favorite ones, from 2 different creators. We've got AOA Mountains and Hills, and we've also got Gogot's Maps, the hand-drawn cartography, and this includes a bunch of really nice trees, like my favorite trees to use inside of Wonderdraft. Links to both of their pages are going to be included inside the zip, so definitely go check those out if you like the style that I'm using inside of here. I'm using those with permission. So let's move into Wonderdraft and talk about installation. So here I am inside of Wonderdraft, and to install something, you can click Menu and say Open User Folder, and that's automatically going to open up a folder that goes to your app data, roaming Wonderdraft. Inside of there, you'll see a folder called Assets, and this is where you install new packs, new asset collections. So I've already got installed, but just for clarity, once you have unzipped my file after you've downloaded it, you'll see it is called Mapstermind Crystal Pack 1_zip. This is not the folder you want to drag in. Don't do that. Go inside of that folder, and inside here, you're going to see a reference folder with links and images and whatnot. But this is the file you want to copy over. So just drag that over, hold down Control if you want to make a duplicate of it, and I'll copy it over, and that should be set. Once it's done being copied over, you can move back into Wonderdraft. And if you've already got a file open you've been working from, you're going to want to go to Assets. And inside of here, make sure you turn on Mapstermind Crystal Pack 1. If it wasn't already there when you started, it might not show up right away. After you turn this on, it'll probably even yell at me right now. If I close this, it's going to say, hey, I have to save it and reopen it in order to see that that is now activated for this particular map. So once you've closed it down, reopened it, you're ready to work from it. Now I'm including this map, although it's kind of a blank ready to work from map instead of including any of the crystal layouts, but you know, kind of cool layout. You'll see it's kind of the beginning part of this map that I had made, but without any of the crystals added. And I'm using this as an example for beginning to do different techniques using the crystals. Something important to mention before we go too deep here is if you move inside of the Crystal Pack 1 folder, you're going to see there's a sprite folder. Inside that sprite folder, you'll see there are mountains and trees. Now, maybe I went a little overboard, but I get really excited to do different techniques when it comes to making maps. I've actually got duplicates of the files. There's 803 different images in this collection, and I copied the exact same thing into the tree folder as well, meaning we can use these crystals as either trees or mountains. But if you think that's overkill, or if you, let's say, you just want to use them as mountains, you could go ahead and just delete this trees folder. It's not going to break anything. And if ever you want to bring it back, you always re-download or go to your zip file, bring it back again. You could even duplicate the mountains folder, rename it trees, and they'll be back again. But you'll see why I do that as I move forward, but maybe you don't want that redundancy. In any case, back into Wonderdraft, let's begin using these. You will find the crystals underneath your symbols. And like I just said, they live both under mountains and under trees. Now, because I'm working with mountains here, I would like to use the tree version of the crystals. So if I scroll down, you're going to see a bunch of extra trees, like I said, installed from Gogot's Maps. But if I scroll down for me all the way to the bottom, we're going to see a whole bunch of different collections of crystals. As I mentioned, we've got 5 different types. So you can see I've kind of got this tall, spiky type of crystal. So we've got an angled version of it. We've got a straight up and down version. We've got clusters of them. We've got like a little baby version of it. And I've got a large cluster of them. So lots of different layouts just for one type of crystal. And that repeats over and over again with all 7 different categories. So let's start stepping through there. In fact, This is just a blank map. If I zoom out, you can see it's just land all the way across. So what do I want to see? We'll zoom up to 100%. I'll move up to the upper left of the map. Where do we find our crystals? Well, we can find them under symbols, under either trees or mountains. I'll just do the tree one. Hand-drawn trees, which I think are right here. As I mentioned, they're really cool. If we scroll all the way for me to the bottom, we're going to get the crystal pack. So there are a whole bunch of different ones here. To begin with, let's just paint out a couple of rows of each and talk about them. To begin with, we've got the first type of crystal. You see it's kind of this very top-heavy, kind of spiky-looking crystal. Selecting the very first one, I'll drop our scale of it down to, let's say, 55 at 100% zoom, and I'll just paint a row of those across. And you see we've got these nice clusters of crystals going across. Now, if you didn't know, you can always scroll your mouse wheel and make larger or smaller. We'll do that a lot more later. But for now, let's move on to this little baby type of the same crystal. So this is supposed to be a little baby one. You see, nice and small. Moving on, I've got these clusters of the tall crystal. So if I paint across, you can see we've got large collections of that. And that's if you want to make a large field of these very quickly and kind of fill up a large space. You can do that very easily. But anyway, that is a cluster. Then we move on to the single vertical ones. So if I paint across, you'll see it's just like that, but it's only a single vertical crystal. And then we've got these tilted varieties. So if I paint across, you see they're going to be rotating all these different angles. So the pattern here is repeated for every crystal type. Moving on to the second crystal type, equivalent here, you see these are very spiky. So we can paint a row of these spiky ones across. And then we've got these tiny baby versions of it. And then we've got clusters, vertical versions of these spikes. This one's really cool. I use this one all the time. And angled versions of those spikes. And you know what? Why don't we just go through these quickly? Here's another cluster. Another baby version. Large clusters of them. The vertical variant. Tilted variant. Those should always kind of match each other. Another type. These are really fun. These make really good like ice crystals, I think. Here's the little baby variant of it. Clusters. Yeah, these look really nice clustered up, I think. Here's a very vertical looking ones. And tilted. Moving down. Getting towards the end here. We've got these very pointed, almost pyramid-like crystal clusters. The baby variant of it. Clusters of them. Vertical variants of them. And tilted. Spikes, 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 spikes. And then we've got these also, I think, work very nice for ice. Let me make a large one there. Yeah, look at that one. Really like that one. Back to 55 to keep it sort of standard here. Paint those across. Here's the baby version. Clusters. Vertical. And tilted. And lastly, we have the hexagon pattern here. And this one might be my favorite. So we get these big hexagon crystals. Here's the baby versions, which I think look very cool. Clusters. Fill up the area very quickly. Vertical hexagon pillars. Use that very often. And we've got our tilted hexagon pillars. So very stylistically different as we use these different types. So just taking a look at that, you can see how we have so many different variations of every type. I've tried to scale everything very uniformly, make them work very well together, tried to make them stylistically work really well with those trees and the mountains that I've mentioned. So that is where we are beginning. So let's jump back into, I guess I'll save that because why not? And then move on into our demo file. Let's talk about some different techniques for integrating this into a map and talk about some different painting techniques. Now, I am including this map. It's not going to have any crystals in there, but it's kind of a nice beginning point. Of course, these mountains won't show up unless you own the AOA mountain pack. But having said that, let's go and paint in some crystals inside of this mountain range. Now, this is where I added them both as trees and as mountains is going to come into play. Because we're playing around inside of a mountain range, I want to add in trees. So if I click on my tree type and scroll down, we're going to see our crystals down here. So if I were to select, let's grab the nice spiky one, this one here. I want it to be angled. So if I begin painting this, it's going to be just integrating itself really nicely and sort of organically inside this mountain. And I'm going to keep changing my scroll wheel here, making them larger and smaller. So I'm beginning with a layer of kind of large ones here. Maybe I could do some giant crystals all laid out in one spot. Scroll down significantly smaller and start filling in some of these in-between spots in the mountain a little bit. And just keep adding those kind of anywhere I think they look nice. Don't want to go... I like them poking out behind mountains. Stylistically, I think that looks cool. And let's put a bunch of slightly larger ones here. Fill out this ground area. And then we can scroll down even further and start putting some very small ones, maybe escaping a little bit from the mountain range. Extend these out, extend these out. We can integrate them inside as well. So you see, I'm just painting them in a little bit. I'm kind of placing them individually as well. I'm using the default placement rate and placement density, but you can always crank that up. If you're not familiar, you can paint across. You see, we get quite a few, and I tried to get some nice default spacing. But if we increase our density, hit undo, you'll see they'll be very tight together. Put that back to default of 1. And the placement rate could also be cranked up, and you'll see that if we increase the density and the placement rate, they're going to be very, very clustered up together. So put those back to 1 each. And you could always do scatter brush, which can be nice, where it's placing a whole bunch of them at the same time. I definitely do use this, but it will eat up your overall sprite count pretty quickly. But anyway, let's turn that off. And keep on painting in just a few extras. Now you'll see here, I'm only using a single style of a single type of crystal. So we could, of course, start integrating other ones if I let these kind of escape out a little bit. We keep on going smaller and smaller, but maybe at a certain point, I want to start bringing in the baby variant of this. So if I move up here, I can get the small version. If you mouse over it, hopefully we'll see. Yeah, it'll show you the name, and it's called Short. So it's Crystal B Short. And clicking on that one, it'll now make the baby variant of these, which are stylistically a little bit different. So I kind of like adding a few of these to extend those out a little bit more on the edges. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. And we always jump back and forth in between those, scattering these wherever I like. We can go super crazy with the detail. But I think that's looking pretty good in the overall mountain range. Maybe I'll make a few more medium ones. You go sneak a few back here. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. So now let's talk a little bit about painting. Actually, before I even do that, let's make a cluster of these in the center. So I'll just start with a couple large ones, scroll down, make them smaller, and add some additional ones in. Scroll down, make them even a little bit smaller still. Make any shape. I'm just kind of making like a forest, but in this case, it's like a forest of crystals. I can make as many of these as I want. Keep on scrolling down and making smaller versions of it. And here I'm kind of making a heart shape just for fun, because why not? Nice spiky heart. Maybe a little wider on the edge here, making those smaller as they move out. And if I was so inclined, we can add additional specificity by grabbing the select tool. I can grab this and pull it in if that's breaking the shape a little bit too more. Move this one down. And also, if you didn't know, let's go back to the crystal. If you're placing these, if you hold down the, is it the shift key? Yeah. Okay. If you hold down the shift key and move your scroll wheel up and down, it'll actually cycle through the different variations. So we could find the very specific one that we want. So let's say I wanted to make a large cluster right in the center. I can say I want exactly that one. That one's looking pretty good. So I'll also place that one specifically, and I'll scroll until I get a very vertical one. I like that. And scroll again. Let's try and get a very angled one. That one's looking pretty good. So place that. And see, I've now manually placed a bunch of those. Now we get that large cluster in the center. Moving back down to a very small, the very small variant of it. I can shrink those down and maybe fill, I want those to be extra small. So yeah, we fill those out a little bit more with these little baby versions. Okay, cool, that's looking good. So now let's talk about some painting techniques that we can use to go along with this. If we move into the Land tab, you'll see this paintbrush right here. Select the ground color brush, and it's kind of a misnomer because it's in the Land menu. It's called ground paintbrush, but it actually works on everything in your map. So if I click this little filter, twirl down, we can limit what this is applying to. Currently, it's going to paint on everything. So it'll paint on the ground, and it'll also paint the crystals. But if I hit undo, if I say click on all, it'll turn all of them off and say, I only want to paint the trees. Now I can paint only trees and not affect the mountain or the ground. But before we do that, I'd like to add on a couple extra colors. And here's something I like to do, especially when I'm starting out with these crystals. Even when I'm doing maps, I tend to make very extreme like primary colors, and when I need more specific ones, I'll add them in as I need to. But for now, why don't I make a bright red, and we'll add a bright yellow, and we'll add a bright dark deep blue, And, let's sneak in a bright green. And you could add in, say, an orange or a purple or a pink. But for now, we've got a white, we've got the primary colors plus green. I'll also add in a pure black. So now we've got a lot of really extreme colors. What's cool about the painting tools in this is we can mix them. So these will go a long way for us. So to begin with, what color crystals should we do? How about we do kind of a teal color? That'll be green and blue. So to begin with, I'll grab this blue color, and our brush size is quite large. Now, there is no color applied anywhere, so even if I have a very low opacity, these are, actually, I guess it does fade in. So right now their color is this kind of tan background, but now I can begin painting, and you see it's going to fade up the color, so I can just paint them in. Now, it's not a bad idea in the beginning to be like, okay, let's make them pure whatever color we want to. So those are very solidly this blue. And now going to something like white, I can pull way back on the brush opacity and start painting back on these and get a lighter white color starting to go in. So maybe I didn't want any of these to be super extreme blue in the beginning. So start pulling back on those just a bit. Looking good. And let's start sneaking in some of that green to get our teal color. And you see it's very weak right now. Actually, it's still, I'll make it even weaker because we want this to be, we want to have a lot of control. We want to be able to kind of wiggle the brush a couple times over it before it starts overriding. So now by combining this extreme blue and this extreme green, but at very low percentages, we're able to get a nice smooth gradient between those colors. So having fed some of these colors in, we're getting a nice teal starting to go. Something I might do is increase that brush opacity just a little bit, shrink by scrolling down my scroll wheel, really small, and then starting to paint through. Well, that's still a little strong. I'll pull back on that. If I paint through very quickly with a slightly stronger opacity, I can make certain crystals a little bit brighter. So instead of it kind of fading from one to another, we can get these really extreme color jumps. Jump back to blue and start pulling these in, and let's get some slightly more extreme blues appearing in certain spots. Having done that, let's pull back on our opacity. And let's do something like grab this dark black, black, and add in some darkness in these. So maybe they get brighter and more glowy as they get to the center of the mountain and they get larger. In that case, I can slowly make these darker. Now, when you click and paint, I'm going to hold it down a little bit. You can see that, okay, eventually it looks a little bit dark, but it's like, that doesn't seem too extreme. But when you hit undo, you'll suddenly see it's like, oh, that's actually a big difference. So little bits go a long way to kind of trick the eye to draw it into these brighter, lighter areas. Shrink that down, and let's grab this kind of heart shape and make the edges a little bit darker. And you can even make everything a little bit darker. Let me make most of this pretty dark. So now if we go back to blue, shrink that back down again, as we paint through in the center part, especially somewhere like here, those colors, grab some green, those will start to pop more because they're in the sea of darker colors. So a lot of these are the techniques I'm going to be repeating over and over again. We can grab this lighter white and start painting in a brighter spot in general. So those will get more of a glowing vibe because they're hanging out with a bunch of darker crystals. But I do find that if we just make a couple of them bright, it's going to seem brighter than if we make them all bright. So if we like maybe grab a couple of these and make that one bright, that was going to jump out amongst a sea of green and blue. But at any point, it's not unusual for me to make that kind of small, and we can go through and make this a little bit extreme, like make a bunch of white light ones, although that's looking pretty good. I thought I was going to be going too far, but kind of like the way that looks. And we can make some lighter ones. We can grab black, and we can make a bunch of, with a very small brush, you can see I can randomly paint some of these to be darker. And we end up with this very extreme kind of contrast with like dark and light, which you could stop right there. Like I like the way this looks with some light ones, some dark ones. But now that we've got like some pretty heavy contrast with light and dark, and believe me, we can go way further than that. We could crank up our brush and really make some of these lighter, like, and don't get too precious with these. Like you can always paint over it again and get your colors back. But by making some of these very light, very dark, now you're like, well, now I want a little bit more uniformity. Then you could go and grab your green one, pull your brush opacity way back, make the brush very large, and now be like, okay, now in an overview, start pulling the green back in again. And now you see we still got some dark and some light, but it's not as extreme because this color is starting to override all of those. So you can do a lot of push and pull just with these colors that I've added in. This blue will make them a little bit darker, grab a little bit white, make everything a little bit lighter. Lots of fun just mixing and matching these colors. If you do end up finding color that you like, let's say we do have a kind of teal color that we're very happy with, we can always make another color, which is going to be somewhere in between the two, and be like, okay, there's a color that's now in between those two, and we could make sure that we get straight to that color where we want to. But you see how we are able to get there via just mixing these primaries. I'll give that a save because it's looking okay. And let's zoom on over to some other part of the map. Let's see what I want to do. Stopping over here, why don't we paint a little bit of a forest? So as I said, this is from Gogots. I'm going to go to tree category, scroll up to one of my favorite trees. I use this tree like 90% of the time. This nice simple tree right there. I usually make them quite small. Maybe I'll go a little bit larger for this demo. But I can start painting in these trees, and I just feel like they're really subtle. You can add a lot of them, and it looks really nice. So I'll make a big cluster of these. Typically, I am hand painting these by placing them exactly where I want. Keep in mind, you can always turn on the spray brush. Right now, be careful with your symbol scale, because as you use your scroll wheel up and down, it'll change your scale of them. But I want the spray brush to be quite small, and you'll see I can make these clusters of them as well. Typically, I try and avoid the river. You don't want them directly on top of that. But let's just make I'll scroll over here. Let's make a forest of them. Rather large cluster. We'll make these very dense. And it's unusual for me to scroll up once and then just get a couple of larger trees, maybe even scroll up one more time. Here's a couple of big ones, not too many. Scroll down a few extra times, maybe get a couple smaller trees on the periphery. And when you're making clusters, this type of thing, try not to make things too, well, stylistically, what you want to do. But you see that I'm making this very much not circular. I'm sort of randomly having a leg kind of shoot out this direction. And maybe something can extend a little bit here. And depending stylistically the way you do it, like you don't want them fading out, or maybe you do. You can always go to your erase and erase out a bunch of these to get these stragglers. So you get these kind of harder edged forests going. So I think that's looking okay. So let's add in some crystals. Now, because these are trees, I want to mix in the mountain version of the crystals. That way I can paint them separately. And I guess I didn't emphasize that while we were up here, but like, if these were the mountain type, every time I tried to paint these crystals, I would be also painting the mountain green and teal and whatnot. So now that we've got green trees, in fact, why don't we even paint those trees a little bit? No, let's not do that yet. Anyway, back in the mountains, let's find a different type of crystal. What type would I like to do? Why don't we do, let's grab these hexagon clusters, and I will place them not with a spray brush, and I'll scroll to a good size. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. So now I can start sprinkling these very manually through this forest. So that's looking pretty good. I kind of like these mingled with the trees. And you'll see how they do mix in very nicely, like kind of hiding behind some trees, but in front of other ones. And that's because the pivot points of the trees and the pivot points of the crystals are working quite well together. When we scroll that a little bit smaller, we'll make some slightly smaller ones around the perimeter. We scroll up a bit. In fact, why don't we make one giant one right there? Scroll down and I'll make a smaller, well, large, but we'll make some more clusters around it. And then I can grab the individual large angled crystal, the tilted one, and let's pull down shift and scroll through, and I can make one very large one right there. And we could just, sprinkle through some random single crystals. Just kind of sprinkle them throughout there. So already I think that looks pretty cool, the way they're mixed in together. But now let's paint them. Moving into land, the brush. I would like to paint what? Well, I can paint the trees. That's what I have turned on right now. So I tend to be very subtle with a color here. So this is typically what this is a place where I would make a manual color, and I'd pull way back on it. Just a little, you see right there, very desaturated. I'm not sure how well that will work. But now if I start painting, and let's crank up that brush opacity here, I can just paint these trees. It's a very blue looking. So let's edit, change the color and make it a little bit warmer. Okay, that's a little bit better. It's just a little blue for my taste. Maybe still a little bit, but that's fine. So I'll paint through, and I can see I've got the trees pretty much a uniform color. Now I can click on the mountains and begin to paint the crystals separately. So we already did teal, so why don't we go with more of a white and yellow on this one? So I can just be like yellow. Oop, let me turn off trees. That's a good idea. So I'm only painting the mountains, and the mountains are the crystals because I painted them in the crystal category. So instantly those are all yellow. Let's grab red, pull our opacity way back, and start painting. Ooh, look at that. Get some orange in there. A little bit darker on the periphery. Actually, I didn't like the darkness too much. So I'll pull back with some yellow, red, scroll down, make them small. Let's get, oop, you gotta be careful on that. Let's just get a little bit of extreme color on there. And then maybe grab white and start lightening some of these. So I can make the ones in this. I typically make the ones in the center a little bit brighter, like we're kind of building up to those big ones, and those often being the most saturated as well, so we could really crank the color on those. And then by mixing some blacks and some whites on the edge, those essentially become more desaturated. Yeah, make this a little more glowy, keep these saturated. So that's starting to look pretty good. And then I like integrating the colors a little bit with the trees, so we can go back and paint the tree category, not the mountains, and start sneaking in maybe a little bit of this yellow, like right here in the center of the forest where there's kind of like a lot of glow from these crystals. We can make those crystals start to glow just a little bit. So that starts mixing in very nicely. You could always turn on ground and paint, so we can also make the ground glow a little bit. So we could just fade in a little bit of yellow. Anywhere that it's sneaking through the trees and the crystals, this color will pop out as well. Grab a little bit of red, let that red fade through. So you don't want to go overboard. I think, I feel like I went a little bit overboard there. Go back to the trees and I could pull back on it. But you can see how you can mix and match, add a little bit more, pull back when you need to. So now we have mingled these crystals inside of a forest. And you could always, so many different things you can do in the software where you can move into the symbols. We could select all of this. We could select all of those and merge them down so it's not taking up so much memory. We can copy and paste those clusters to other spots. But that's looking pretty good as another type of painted crystal. Let's move on over to some mountaintops and talk about placing crystals on top of mountains. So again, here are mountains. So I want to paint tree type crystals so they don't mingle. So if we grab this tree, and what type should we use this time? Let's use these spiky ones. So yeah, these spiky ones, pretty extreme and spiky. I would like to paint them on top of these mountains, probably kind of small. But you'll see if I try and paint on top of the mountain, it's going to place behind the mountain. Essentially, these mountains, if it's halfway below, it's going to appear in front. If it's halfway above, it's going to appear behind it. So how do we go on top of the mountain? It's not too difficult. We can go into our layers in the upper right, symbol layers. And as soon as I turn on layer management, it's going to show a bunch of layers here. We don't have to worry about that because now we go back to our main tab and you see that we have a layers default. Typically, it doesn't worry about that because we haven't done anything custom with layers. But now we can say, hey, I would like this to be layer +1 from the default. Something very important. If you do this, you got to remember to turn it off when you're done with that. Because if you paint things on the wrong layers, it can cause you trouble later. So just be very careful when doing this. But having said that, I can now paint this right on top of the mountain. And you see it's actually appearing on top of the mountain. So I'll scroll pretty small on these. Actually, I'm going to go extra small. So yeah, we'll go pretty tiny. And what I like doing is kind of painting them along the ridges. So starting at the top, I'll make some of the tallest ones. And I'm only doing a couple. I'm kind of doing the most blatant spot where these are down these ridges, only the largest of them, because I'll shrink and do the next layer of those. So we can even let those travel down this ridge. And this is just stylistically what I like to do. Obviously, you can do whatever the heck you want. But yeah, painting these down the ridges, I have found looks pretty cool. And now that I've done that, I might maybe grab this vertical variant and scroll it up a little bit and be like, okay, there's an extra tall one here and here. Maybe, no, don't like that. A little further back. Yeah, one right there. One here, one there. So some extra large ones. Go back to the angled ones, scroll down extra small. Yeah, these are nice and tiny now, and I can paint them further along the ridge. And if I want to go even smaller, we can go to the tiny variant here, which is this one. And maybe scroll up a little bit to match. And now I can continue those down these smaller ridges, painting them, placing them anywhere that I want to. And of course, you can do this forever, do this for hours and hours and hours, sprinkle them around, make ones further down the mountainside over here on top of it, layer different types of crystals on top of it. Right now, we've been using kind of one category as we go, but we can mingle different types. I've definitely done that in the example map. So now that I've painted a bunch of these around, I mean, I would probably spend a lot more time on that, but to move on with this video, back to our land, paintbrush, and we paint these colors anything that we want. These are now trees. So I can say, what color should we go? Let's go with a red. So now as I paint, you see this red is appearing only on top of the crystals that are now painted along the ridges. So we can go kind of with a purpley red by adding some blue on top of red. So we get actually some nice kind of pinks going on. But now that we've got a blue base, I can paint more red on, and maybe they get more red as they get to the top of the mountain. That's looking kind of cool. And who knows, maybe on this type, maybe they get darker as they get to the top of a mountain. Like these mountaintops get extra dark and maybe dangerous by being these darker colors. So yeah, there's some crystals on top, a layer on top of the mountains. So you can see here how I started layering up different things, just painting these crystals in different locations and getting very different styles, being very careful and meticulous in some places, and some places you just go wild. So let's pop back open that. I'll save this. In fact, I'll leave this file, a variation of this file included, so you could also open this up as an example. And just to be careful, I will go back to symbols and paint. Let's go to this and say layer back to default. That way, if you continue from the file, it's not going to be on the wrong layer. But anyway, I'll save that. And let's open up the reference map. And you can see I had done some very similar things in this map. If I zoom up, we've got these hexagon patterns, and there's the large vertical ones, and eventually you get down to these really tiny ones. And I used the erase tool and erased out circles inside of it, kind of hopefully adding on a different style. Here I added crystals in the water and then painted the watercolor to be kind of a yellow to make them feel like they're glowing a little bit more. Here I did these crystals in black, and I feel like they give a very different vibe. In fact, if you use the crystals and combine them with different rock types, you can actually make them feel a little bit like rocks. And if I move over here, you see I painted them a gold color, and they do start feeling a little bit like gold. I like painting and erasing out these little paths and making them glow. You can see a lot of the painting of the blue on top of the trees to make it feel like the glow is escaping from the crystals and illuminating the surroundings. I do that a lot, in fact, all over these places. Over here, stylistically, I like these. These are those tiny little stumpy versions. It's actually the baby version of the hexagon crystal, but by carefully placing them, we can stack them very nicely on top of each other. Using them very carefully individually here, they mingle very well with the mountains and the trees. Here you see a similar style that we just did, painting these on top of the mountains, going really thick with the crystals and then fading out to just a handful of trees. And here you see a lot of variation with the color. It's going to lose resolution, but as I scroll up, you can see like I used autumn colors here, and the variation between crystals is very heavy. Here you see it's very uniform, very kind of glass-like, just mostly white with a hint of blue. And here I'm using extreme browns and yellows and reds mixed with greens to get an autumn effect. But anyway, we could just talk about these things forever. I really like this combination of green colors. They feel very transparent. I know the resolution drops as I scroll up too much, but a lot of fun here. A lot of color combinations giving you very different effects. Over here, we've got these mountains ones where I painted them with the mountains. Over here, I added a lot of the very sharp small crystal in order to make it feel like maybe some ice clusters floating around. So they can work beyond just the idea of crystals. Over here, painted a very dark shore and then bright crystals to make it feel like maybe some lightning, some magical giant lightning struck this land and shattered through and grew these crystals. Here, mingling different types of crystals. Here's these tall kind of pyramid-esque ones, but then one hexagon crystal in the center. So that must be a special one that some adventurers would want to journey to. Over here, some very natural earthy colors, making them feel more like they're part of this mountain range. Over here, mingling just a handful of them, breaking out from a cluster as if they burst out of the ground. So anyway, you saw the techniques that I used to place these around. So hopefully that is helpful, and hopefully you get a bunch of use out of this crystal pack. I've had a lot of fun using it, and I'd love any feedback or suggestions, things you'd like to see in the future. It took a while to put them together, but I feel like it's a very powerful collection of crystals all in one place. Maybe I could think of additional crystal types. That's why I made sure to name it Crystal Pack 1, because who knows what you could think of in the future. I've got a couple of ideas for packs in the future that are not crystal based. I've already prototyped some. I'm not gonna show it off because then people might be like, oh, I want it now. But yeah, kind of excited. So thank you so much for checking this out. And extra thank you if you purchased it and are supporting the Mapster Mind Asset Collection. That will encourage me to make more of them in the future. But for the most part, it's just fun to get these out there in the world so other people can use them and make cool things. I did share these with one person on Reddit because I really like the style of his map, and I want to see how somebody else might use it and get some feedback. So this is from David Istan, and he makes a bunch of maps. And in this map, he used the crystals just in one little spot right here. See how they're just barely sprinkled in. So it's not like you have to go overboard like in my map where I put them everywhere. Because, you know, like I said, I was testing them out, but here just sprinkling them in a little bit, mixing them with some mountains. So very cool. I really like the style of his maps. You can see over here, I think there might be a few more even. Let's see, can I scroll up extra? Yeah. You see, yeah, they're sprinkled through this forest and sprinkled in here, nice and subtly. So yeah, very cool. Please tag me on Reddit. I am Mapstermind on Reddit. I'd love to see anything that you make. I'll be keeping an eye out for if anybody is using those. And again, any suggestions you might have. But for now, that should wrap up this video. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.